Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to help you ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Stephen and I'm your host for this season, your friendly neighborhood Stephen, and it's good to see you all. I'm so thrilled that you could join us today, wherever you're joining from. Today's special guest is Claire Nicholls. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, hello.
Claire is a regional minister for London Baptists, supporting more than 80 churches across southeast London. She also oversees the Justice Hub, focusing on empowering women in leadership and promoting justice within the church and wider community. And before ministry, Claire was a maths teacher in Derbyshire and later served churches in North Manchester and South Croydon. She's passionate about bringing people together across difference and helping churches thrive in their local context. Outside work, she's a keen baker, so I know you've been watching Bake Off, hopefully. Enjoys walking and live music and loves a good laugh, especially when she can find last-minute tickets to a London concert or show. Claire, it's really good to have you with us on today's show. Joining us from JPIT today is Rue Stewart, Head of Public Issues for the URC. Hi, Rue.
Hello, good to be here again.
It's good to have you back again. We're going to have a fantastic conversation today, but before we go any further, we always ask our guests this question. So, Claire, I'm going to ask you this question to kick us off. Claire, does politics belong in the pulpit, do you think?
Yes, it definitely does. So you have to be very careful, though, not to bring too much of your own personal opinion and politics into the pulpit, although it inevitably comes out. But you have to do it with grace and sensitivity. But yes, Jesus was political and challenged and spoke out on the key issues of the day. And one of my key passages for that was actually before he was born, when in the Magnificat, when he talks about challenging the rulers of the day, filling the hungry with good things, and sending the rich away empty. And my hope in my preaching is that I help people to discover how Scripture speaks into the world that we're living in, and that how that affects how we approach life. And inevitably, that comes with some challenges and reflections on the news and what's going on in politics. So I've always tried to preach with the news in one hand and the Bible in the other, and have them in conversation with one another. And politics is part of that.
I love that. Politics is a part of our lives. And, you know, the Bible might not tell you what Snapchat filter to use, but the things of life, the things that we all care about deep down inside, I think the Bible speaks a lot about. So thank you very much for that answer, Claire. So let's get some context with some recent news headlines. Just a reminder that these headlines were fresh at the time that we are recording this episode. But nevertheless, they might be a little bit out of date when you come to listen to this episode. But never mind that, we're conversating together today on these headlines. So firstly, Israeli hostages have been released, and it's been the start of the ceasefire agreement, and Egypt is holding a peace summit on Gaza too. So there's a lot to be thankful there to God. There are concerns at Trump sending missiles to Kiev in Ukraine, in the Ukraine war. Rachel Reeves is considering tax rises and spending cuts in preparation for November's autumn budget. And just a note for you all, it's the end of British summertime. I'm seeing lots of sad faces. The clocks are going to go back on the 26th of October. And it's the Globing Tipping Points report. They reported that coral reefs are in serious danger from global heating. So we're still in a seasonal creation tide as well. So let's hold those things in tension as we power on and conversate today. This episode, we are focusing on Sunday, the 26th of October. That's the 20th Sunday after Pentecost in Year C. And there are several awareness days and themes to bear in mind this week. It's still Black History Month, and that's inviting us to celebrate stories of resilience, faith, and the ongoing work for racial justice wherever you are. And also on the 24th of October, it's United Nations Day. I think that's formally celebrating the conception of the United Nations, which was initially instituted to help prevent wars. So there's a lot that we can celebrate on that day and pray for peace. God's peace, not the absence of war, but God's type of peace. So we encourage you as congregations, as people that lead worship, to explore creative ways to respond to those themes that you've just heard in today's episode. The lectionary readings are from Joel chapter 2, verses 23 to 32, Psalm 65, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, then on to 16 and 18, and lastly, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. There are extra verses, extra Bible readings that we found that I'm hoping will prop up in our conversations, and links that you might find as well. Claire, is there a passage from what we've just mentioned that you'd love to pick to preach from, or a theme that you've seen across the lectionary text today?
The passage I was particularly drawn to was Joel 2, and I love the Old Testament prophets, and I will often try and preach on them. But the thing about Joel 2 is it's so full of hope. And one of the messages that God has put on my heart recently is, well, in this season really, is it's the hope that keeps us here. Because in January, there was a big, there was an art installation. I didn't realise it was an art installation on billboards in London that said, it's the hope that keeps us here. And on my way to the office, I walk along Cable Street, which is where the fascists met the anti-fascists. And the fascists were stopped going into East London. And there were a series of weeks where the number of billboards with this message on increased and just doubled over 4 weeks. And that's really spoken into my preaching in the last year. And they were put up around the time that Trump was inaugurated. And you can read into that what you will. But it also speaks to me today in particular, because as we're recording, the hostages in Israel and Gaza are being released in the ceasefire handover. And I'm quite cynical about that and whether actually peace comes, but actually there is hope in what is happening today, and hope in these actions. And if it leads to lasting peace, then where we see pictures of whole cities and communities devastated in Gaza, that this is not the end of their story, and it is the hope that restoration will happen, that keeps us praying, keeps us fighting for justice. And one of the things that really strikes me in the passage is the way that different people are enabled. So even those who would normally be left behind, the men and the women, the young and the old, even the slaves who had no status, the male and the female slaves, will be empowered by the Spirit. And it speaks about those who have no voice, and that God will speak through them. And it also reminds us that God is bigger than us and the way we do things. And it doesn't all depend on us, which is quite a relief. To be honest, sometimes when you speak out on justice issues, it can be like banging our head against a brick wall, and it can be exhausting. But this passage in particular reminds us that it doesn't all depend on us, and there is hope beyond ourselves. And that's something that keeps me going, both in my role and keeps me going in fighting for justice and speaking out against what is wrong. Yeah.
Claire, you said some really important things there that I'd just like to just pause. I think the word "sila" that the psalmist employs. Let's just pause and think on these things. He talks about the hope that keeps us here. The hope that keeps us here. I love that. And I wish I could have seen that billboard. So I'll try and do a Google search later and try and see pictures of that billboard there. And you reminded that it's not the end of the story, and it doesn't all depend upon us. And the Joel there is speaking about a radical vision of inclusion. God's Spirit poured out on all people, not just priests, not just vicars. I was going to say not just prophets, but all. And that speaks to a radical inclusion. Rue, I'm just going to bring you in there. But what have you gleaned from the prophet Joel as you read through?
Well, what part of my strategy whenever I look into scripture is I try my best to avoid the titles. that the editors and the publishers have put in, because I want to try and read it through my own lens first, and then maybe I'll have a look at the title. So I had titled this passage "Waiting for Restoration," and then I had a sneaky look and saw what other people and other Bibles, other versions had put as their title, and their NRSV has "The Promise to Restore Israel." And I thought, okay, I must have been on the right track then. It was on a similar track to them, that kind of idea of waiting for restoration. And I mean, that verse in verse 25 in chapter 2 is kind of one of those ones that a lot of people quote, even people who don't go to church sometimes quote that one. I don't know if you've ever heard it. "I'll repay you
Yeah,
for the years that the locusts have stolen." That kind of translation. But they don't really quote the very end of it. And I'm really struck by that. I wonder if, if people in your churches are going to be doing the readings on Sunday and they're going to read this out. Are they going to get to that end of that verse and have a little bit of a, oh, I wasn't expecting that kind of moment? Or the people who are listening, are they going to go, oh, because it says, I will repay you for the years. God says, I will repay you for those years that have been stolen. And I'm thinking about, those people who've been suffering and struggling because of the oppression and the war in the conflict in Gaza. People who have been kept as refugees, or no, sorry, the people who have not been kept as refugees, and that's another issue. But the people who've been kept there against their will, and the years that have been stolen from them, both those from both sides of the conflict, actually, who've been kept in places that they didn't want to be in, and in some cases have lost their lives. And that tremendous sense of, is God going to restore that in that pain and in that real struggle? Or I think of other people in your congregations who are going to be going through tough times as well. And that promise from Joel for the people of God at that time, that God would restore what the locusts have eaten away, what has been stolen from you. I'm wondering, is that something that we can hold on to as well in these days? But it's that really challenging part at the end of the verse, which sits uncomfortably with me, which is, my great army that I sent against you. And it's that sense that Joel is saying that perhaps the trouble and the issues that were being faced by the children of God, perhaps God had a hand in that. And that's quite a struggle for me to read with my lens. And that's the bit which stood out for me. I actually wrote beside it, can we trust this God? This God who might bring difficulty and challenge towards us? A God that says that they love us and they care for us, but also that they might have sent something against the people. And it reminds me that we can't pigeonhole and box God in. That sometimes, there are easy answers and easy ways to explain away these verses and say, oh, well, that's not really what it means. But certainly when I read it and I look at it and think, is this the same God that I read about elsewhere in Scripture? It really causes me to check that and to think broader than just my own preconceptions about who God is and how God behaves. Because sometimes we unpick these verses and we see more than we were expecting to see. So that waiting for restoration, sometimes we're sort of thinking, why God? Why is it now? Why is it this time? And I think it's okay for us sometimes to say, why God? And almost to say, why have you led us to this place, God? Even in those difficult times, where it's very easy for us to say sometimes, God would never do that. God would never send that difficulty or that challenge. God doesn't want that for our lives. And those are good things to proclaim and to hold on to and to give us hope. But then you come across that little verse and you think, okay, maybe I need to think about this a little bit more. So that might be a little challenge for people if they're going to read this reading. But then the next verse, there's a bit of hope. It says, God has dealt wondrously with you. And so I want to hang on to those kind of senses of God can deal wondrously with us, even in difficult times. So that gives me a bit of hope.
Hope abounds in that reading. God's Spirit poured out on all. Yeah, you've raised some really interesting points for us to chew upon there, Rue. I think it's important that we consider these things and that we wrestle with the text. And I think when we wrestle with the text, it's us that's changed in accordance with God. Yeah. I'm going to point us very slightly to maybe the Psalms. Is there a psalm that stood out to you from the reading there? Psalm 65, perhaps.
You begin to understand the perspective of God that the people of Israel had, and so you read these psalms and you begin to understand that everything, they put everything on God. So they have a different kind of approach to these questions of who did what, because God, there's a theology throughout them that says that God is ultimately in control of everything. When you look at that verse that Rue just mentioned, that brings us some challenges about God bringing that army of locusts. You begin to understand that there might be a different view of where evil comes from and where the bad stuff comes from in the way that things were written in that time and things were said in that time. So, but the Psalms are helpful in this because Psalm 65, it again picks up on that theme of restoration and hope. And you've got in verse 3, when the deeds of iniquity overwhelm us, you forgive our transgressions. So you could see that plague of locusts as judgment, and you could see it as it was actually that's happened because of the way that we've treated the world. Though it's happened because the whole of creation is fallen, or any other kind of way of seeing that, but actually that God isn't all bad. It's like moving on to the second verse that we talked about, that God doesn't, that's not the way God wants it to be necessarily, even though we're living in that broken place. And that whole theme of God being with us through our sufferings, and the psalm kind of counteracts that challenge of where the injustice and where the suffering comes from, and reminds us that God has strength, and he silences, and where the waves roar, where there's things going on. This is verse 7, that God silences that roaring and takes it all away. And it brings to me pictures of when those moments, when going back to the war, the conflict, those moments when the gunfire ceases for a moment, and you pause, and you remember that there's a bigger picture than what you're experiencing right now, and that can be difficult when you're in the midst of it. But Jesus gives us that. I think God gives us that peace through Jesus.
I think you've reminded me of an image that I saw very recently. It was a national newspaper, I forget which one, but they split the front page in half, and on one side was a father and a son from Israel, and the other side a father and a son from Palestine, and they were both with tears of joy and happiness. And for me, it was a reminder of the two sides of human resistance, and the pain in the midst of it. We talked about what happens after the rain, after the pain, after the so Psalm 65 here is for me a psalm of thanksgiving. It's a reminder that even in our politics, can we give thanks to God for something? Can that be a point of resistance? Can that be something that, despite the reality of what we're seeing, can we give thanks to God in a culture of scarcity? Can we invite God to be that which is in throughout the verse, the God of abundance, the one who, by your strength, you established the mountains, you are girded with might, you silence the roaring seas, there in verse 7. You know, can we see the vision there of water, soil, crops, and can we bring some of our care for God's creation, both in our congregations and in our world today? And obviously the link to, for me, for Black History Month is the link there to remember that in the midst of the suffering, there is something that we can give thanks for. I remember the spirituals we talked over the last few episodes of Psalms where they say by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we were in Zion. I think this is a reminder of, in the face of oppression, in the face of injustice, and what you said there in the beginning, Claire, and relating back to Joel, the hope that keeps us here. The hope that we have is in the God that makes these things grow, that we're still in the season of harvest, still in the season of creation. That we can still give thanks to God despite the pain and injustice that we see, trusting that at the end, by the grace of God, we will see that which we long for, and hopeful. The hope that's, for me, is a hope that keeps us here. But Rue, have you got anything that you'd like to bring in there?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the hymn "Great is Thy Faithfulness, O God, my Father." That second verse,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it's was it what is the second verse? How does it go? Winter and springtime and seed time and harvest, something like that. Sun, moon, and stars,
Yes.
and their courses
Their
above,
course live
join with all
above,
nature in manifold witness
manifold
to your
witness.
great
Yeah,
faithfulness, mercy, and love. And that was the kind of hymn I thought, yeah, that's the one I would pair with this. It's that kind of sense of seasons and how God,
yes,
has established the seasons. You may have already had a harvest service in your church or something to do with season of creation. And this kind of just, helps us to remember that as well, that there are times and seasons for things, and God is the one who holds those together. So I get some real sense that, when we go through those difficult patches, when we go through the challenges, I mean, it's not a given that things are going to get better, but I think you kind of think, I have a belief and I have a hope that they're going to get better, because as surely as the sun and the earth spin, and as surely as the moon goes round, God is with us, and surely good times are coming again. And that kind of sense of hope that we can have, that if God can keep the water cycle flowing and the carbon cycle flowing, and the earth be replenished with clean air for us to have, even despite the fact that we've poisoned the air, we've poisoned the water courses, and we've done really badly in terms of caring for creation, that still there is the promised hope of restoration. And it's that kind of sense, again, I think, just like the Joel passage, that idea of waiting for that restoration, that the times and seasons are coming. Because God is faithful, we can hang on to that, even though it looks a lot like things are really hard and really difficult at the moment. But I have that hope, that good times are coming again. And that very famous verse again, verse 11, "You crown the year with your beauty." I just think that's such a beautiful image, isn't it? That's not the only time we get the word crown in our readings, but that idea of that God crowns it is just so beautiful and rich, that verse. If there's a hymn that has that in it, that's the hymn I would go for. But if not, "Great is Thy Faithfulness" is a good one.
I also looked at one of the additional readings, Psalm 84,
yeah,
and that
yes.
talks about the Valley of Baca. That valley symbolises a place of trial and hardship and weeping, but transformation is promised, because it says they make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. And it's those little, it's not, the rain hasn't completely come yet, but there's that early rain that promises more, and where everything is dry and arid, and those pictures coming over from the Middle East, you see that. It promises a new landscape that's coming, and it's probably, that new landscape is probably going to be better than what it was before it was destroyed. And I just love that imagery of walking through a valley and beginning to see the rivers start to flow, because there is newness coming. I think that's important today.
It's so important. I mean, it's again a reminder of the hope that we have, of the God that walks alongside us, which reminds me of one of the verses that is in Second Timothy. I'll try and find it here so we can move along to it. It says, I think in verse 17, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17, "But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and that all peoples might hear it, all Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth." what I'm really drawn to there is the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, and that is really in line with what we've been talking about, perseverance,
Mm.
in spite of not seeing what we would like to see, but persevering. I'm wondering, in your reading of Second Timothy, what stood out to you? Where's God's heart for justice in this reading today?
I think for me it's the whole thing about fighting the good fight.
Yeah,
The race is finished, the faith has been kept, but fighting the good fight. And I've talked about, I mean, fighting for justice can be like banging your head against a brick wall. And that it does feel like a fight, but it feels like a good fight and a fight worth having.
yeah,
And it links back to what we've just talked about the where the dry ground gets water again and things begin to grow. And I think that Paul probably felt alone and no one came to support him, but he always knew that God was there. And it's a great foundation for endurance in that passage. And if I was preaching on the passage, I might link it to some of the stories from Black History Month.
yeah,
Because the theme of Black History Month is standing firm in power and pride. And so we're invited to remember the resilience, dignity and legacy of British Black communities, whilst remembering that the justice fight continues. So I had a look at the Churches Together in England resources, which have a great story about Dr. Harold Moody, who's
yes,
remembered for establishing the League of Coloured People, which was the first British organisation to campaign against racial prejudice in this country. And he was also a doctor. He was born in Jamaica, came to Britain in 1904 and studied medicine. And he believed God had called him to work with the poor people in Peckham. This is before the NHS, and many doctors refused to treat Black people. And his story is really inspirational. And I think an example of fighting the good fight, because I can't imagine that was easy, because he would have suffered racism himself. And I imagine that he would have got very frustrated at times, but he believed that change would come. And his story reminds us that perseverance is really important, and endurance and trust in God, and that Jesus leads us as we speak out into the issues of today, both through word and through action. And he was doing both. He'd set up this organisation to speak out, but also he was acting it out by serving the poor people of Peckham. And that's the enabling and flourishing of all people that Joel talks about, even the people we might not think about, male, female, young, old, slave and free. And I love that Black History Month gives us a chance to tell some of those stories, because we know the big ones, but
yeah,
we don't necessarily know those ones that are just down the road from us. Peckham's in my area, with the churches I look after, and
yeah.
I know that area very well, and it's great to hear that story happening there.
I used to live in Peckham, and I love the fact that that's highlighted for me, someone that is worthy of praise and honor, and you reminded me of another person that is often overlooked, but this is a footballer. His name's called Garth Crooks. Maybe you've heard of him. He was one of the first black footballers in the UK. And the reason why I highlight his story is because he faced much prejudice and injustice, but he still continued to campaign for others. In fact, when his career finished, he continued to campaign for others, planting seeds that he wouldn't see grow till many, 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 many years later. So that's encouragement for us all, that indeed the Lord does stand by those as they fight the good fight and persevere. We don't do it alone, which again points us back to what you shared, Claire, in the first reading there from Joel. We're not alone in this, in keeping the faith and fighting the good fight. There are others that have gone before us and others that will continue to fight the good fight long after we're gone. But for me, that's hope, but it's realism. It's realism as well, that there is a fight that continues still to this day, and God stands by each and every one of those, even when you might feel deserted, because I'm sure Paul felt deserted, nearing death, and reflecting on his life as an apostle. Rue, I'm going to bring you in there. What do you glean there from 2 Timothy?
I am going to be a bit cheeky. I was thinking about, it's not like me to be a little bit subversive.
Not
Um,
at all.
But I was thinking, what would be a good way in for a congregation? If you were preaching to your congregation, what would be the kind of hook that you might want to grab people with? And I came to this passage, and the person I thought of, the Lord may forgive me, was Donald Trump, bless his heart,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
who really, really, really wants to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. And I really admire anyone who wants to bring peace. I'm all about peace and justice. But if you're doing something because you want to get an award, a crown out of it, you're probably doing it for the wrong motivations. I'm just gonna leave that there. But I was really taken with that verse 8 in Second Timothy chapter 4, where it's got that reserved for me is the crown of righteousness. What a great reward that would be. And anyone who really does deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, yeah, that's a bit like a crown of righteousness as well, I guess. But the difference is that verse also has the person who awards the crown of righteousness in it as well, and that is the Lord, the righteous judge. So whenever I was a kid, I used to do a lot of piano competitions. I'm a musician, love playing a bit of piano, and the people who would, judge us in the competition were people who were also excellent musicians. If I had someone who was just some person off the street who was, gifted in many ways, but not a musician, handing me an award, it wouldn't mean as much, to be honest. I mean, they meant they like my music, but it wouldn't be the same as someone who's really studied the craft and really knows it inside out. So for me, a kind of hook for this is the idea that if God is the righteous judge, then God is the one who really will know us in and out, inside and outside, and know that we're the one that's worthy of that kind of crown, that kind of recognition. We don't need to pursue that. We just know that God is aware of it. And I think of all of those saints throughout the years, and even living in our churches right now, the people who do that quiet work of restoration, of reconciliation, of preaching the word in season and out of season, who care for those who are very quiet. They don't make a big noise about it. They're not looking for awards. They're not looking for adulation. They do it because they know that that's what they're called to do, and they just get on with it. They're the ones I want to give a crown of righteousness to. They're the ones that God sees and God knows and God is completely aware of and loves. And I just think that's such a hope for me when I get so frustrated with the Donald Trumps of this world who want to be seen, that actually there are so many people doing brilliant things. And Black History Month, it draws our attention to that as well, of people that we perhaps have missed, people that we haven't really thought about. But they've been working so hard to bring about that sense of righteousness, that rightness coming to us, justice coming to us. And God, as the righteous judge, is ready and willing with those crowns, not to make a big show of people, but just to say, well done, good and faithful servant. And that's not just for later, that's for now as well, I think. And we can be part of that too, acknowledging and remembering those people in our communities who really are making a positive difference. So there was a hook I thought you might take something out of that, and that might be a way in for some folks. What are we striving for? Is it to be recognized, or is it because it's just the right thing to do? But the recognition will come.
I love that. I think I once done a sermon called "Who Gets the Prize?" Similarly on that theme. But I think in addition to that, you've just got to. I think because it's always right to connect humility and stewardship together. Why are you doing this? Why are you really doing this? Yeah. So thank you for that, Rue. That's very, very helpful. Claire, I'm gonna take us to the Luke reading, the Gospel of Luke reading from Luke 18 talks about the Pharisee and the tax collector. Similarly, we were just talking about humility and stewardship. Humility in the political world. What do we do with that? How do we relate that to this Luke reading? Or what did you see from the Luke reading as you read
it? Well, because I've been thinking about the God, the Joel passage and the male females, like the slaves, and that kind of thing, young and old. I think sometimes we forget what status we have and what privilege we have. And actually this passage tells us that we might think we're not broken, but actually we're probably more broken than we realize. And the Pharisee thinks they've got everything right. The tax collector knows that they haven't. The Pharisee thinks they have. And I think there is a danger, particularly just thinking around justice issues, and that we become quite self-righteous in it, and we think we're going in the right direction. But things like keeping the rules, it's not enough. It's got to be a heart thing, and we've got to open our hearts to be changed. It's often something I often preach at the beginning of a sermon. I mean, pray at the beginning of a sermon that we open our hearts to be changed, because God can use any one of us to make a difference. And we don't put ourselves in that place to make a difference. Only God puts us in that place. And we shouldn't reject someone's voice because we don't like what they do. We shouldn't reject the voice of the tax collector, because they may be a prophet in disguise. One of the things that we often talk about in JPIT is finding people with lived experience and hearing their stories. But when we do so, we have to remember that those with lived experience are also wounded by the struggle, and their past and even their presence. Their present might mean that they're not our kind of people, but part of recognising the struggle for justice and living in it is recognising that the voices and the contributions of those around us who are different to us. The Pharisee would be very happy to do good to people, and a lot of our churches do a lot of good to people, and many of our politicians, they do good to people. Well, they think they do. But if we want to be active in changing the world, we need to choose not just to do good to, but to be with people. In my last ministry, that was something that was much of a focus of the work that we did in the community. We didn't just offer food. We invited people to join us in helping us distribute the food, who need that food themselves. And we saw people's lives change through that and their stories heard, which was really important.
I love that, because it's a reminder that, when we're doing these things, it's about dignity and respect for fellow human beings. It's not about virtue signaling, or if we're putting it in our context, that story saying, look, we've got food banks here for everyone. We're doing great jobs. We've got this at our church, and our church is doing this. It's not about that. It's about really helping people that are less fortunate ourselves, but lifting them up as well as people. And it's also a note to communities of faith and people of God everywhere that, we cultivate humility by doing these things, not by falling into despair or doing nothing, by being, I think, what's the word that I'm looking for? A bit passive or inactive. I love the book of James. It's a reminder for me constantly that faith and action go hand in hand. So as we do these things, we are hearers and doers of the word together. Rue, I'm going to bring you in there. Anything you glean from Luke?
Well, I was just going to respond there. I was thinking about the the famous C.S. Lewis quote about humility, isn't it? That true humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking about yourself less. Which I find really helpful. And I was also then drawn to that quite staggering Instagram account you might have come across, which is called Preachers Sneakers. It's got an N in the middle of it. Preachers
Sneakers. I love that account.
It's amazing page, and it highlights various, usually celebrity preachers, usually prosperity teaching preachers around the world, who are very, very rich. And it will point out the outfits that they're wearing. This jumper that costs $4,000, or these sneakers which cost $6,000 or something, customized things, and just really flaunting wealth. And so for me, that's what came up for me. Firstly, it was around that kind of idea of performative Christianity, where the Pharisee, obviously not a Christian, but he was talking about, I fast twice a week, I give a tenth of all of my income. But then I was also thinking about, what about how we even dress ourselves when we meet with people? It's such a basic thing, and it's maybe something that we often overlook in our preaching, but I think it's worth saying every so often that sometimes how we conduct ourselves as Christians can be a huge barrier for those people who are on the edges of Christianity or on the edges of faith.
It's about the heart, I guess, is what we're talking about today. And I think that's what Jesus would have drawn attention to as well. But we have had a fantastic time today, challenging each other and encouraging one another. We've been reminded there by Joel, the prophet Joel, that God's Spirit is poured out on all people, young and old, servant and free. That means the prophetic voice isn't just belonging to the powerful, but it's for all. So the invitation, I guess, for us is to stay faithful, to keep praying, to keep serving, and keep believing that the Spirit still moves in our day. My thanks to Claire, our special guest today, and our JPIT team member, Rue. Thank you all for listening. I hope this episode helps you in your preaching prep. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and do share this episode with your friends. We've also got online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. So do tune in and subscribe there. I'm going to leave you with the words of Desmond Tutu today. He says, do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Or as my mum told me when I was young, brighten your corner, Stephen, brighten your corner. May we each go and do our little bit of good trouble this week in the name of Jesus. Have a great week, friends. God bless.